Okay, this is week 7, part 2. I got this quote from Helen Keller. People do not like to think. If one thinks, one must reach conclusions. Conclusions are not always pleasant. Isn't that true? Okay, we're going to go over the case study of the Space Shuttle Challenger. This was a program that America had from around late 1960s all the way up until just recently in the 2000s when it was mothballed. At the time of the episode of the Challenger, there was up to 24 launches. And a lot of these launches would occur with a lot of cancellations, and it got to the point where people were, you know, there was routine to send a launch shuttle up into space. And plus, it was also rather boring because there would be quite a bit of cancellations. Let's look at what the Challenger. Why was the Challenger so special? So the launch was set for January 28th in 1986 at the Space Center, Florida. And at the time, there was this really freakish freezing, less than 30-degree temperatures at the Space Center, which was forecasted. And I remember this because I was happened to watch this live. One of those weird times in your life where you can think of, why was I watching this? Like I said, at the time, these launches were relatively routine. It would be like something, watching something now that has been done quite a bit of times, and the novelty is washed off. But for some reason, I was watching this during the day because I was at in Pasadena at the time with my dad, who was working for the Pasadena, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And it was just one of those weird times in your life when I was, you're out of your fishbowl and you're put into this whole area that you're not familiar with, and so I can just remember this like this was yesterday because of that multiple things. Plus, I was also a space geek, and I was really into the space shuttle as a kid. Um, so we knew that there was really this really freakish freezing temperatures, and at the launch, I remember this because remember I was watching this live. I saw them panning around the photos, and just saw icicles on the launch pad. There was oranges from these trees, these orange groves next door to the launch site that had icicles on them. So you knew it was cold, and you knew it was weird. And I just had this really weird feeling about it. And then, even then, um, we knew there was past cancellations of this particular launch, and up until this day, January 28th. So there was a lot of pressure for NASA to get this bird in the air. And plus, Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, was scheduled to do a State of the Union update on how America is so great with the shuttle being launched the previous day. So there was quite a bit of pressure. There was 7 souls on board, and one of the reasons why this launch was particularly um, unique was there was the first ever civilian astronaut. Her name was Christy McAuliffe, and she was a female elementary teacher. And all of these particular astronauts, you can see the diversity on here, all had a very unique and amazing story to tell as far as who they were. And as I told you guys last on Monday, if you haven't seen the Netflix series on this, it's a really good series. So part of the engineering and the shuttle were these things called booster rockets, which were put to the side of the booster tank. And this main purpose of these booster rockets was to get the rocket into the air off the launch pad, and then they'd burn for 2 or 3 minutes, and then they'd fall off. And if you've ever seen Apollo 13, where they have all these different stations, and everybody says launch go, pre-hop go. They have all these people say go, 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 go. That is all these individual pieces of the process of the rocket launch that all have to be aligned in agreement in order to launch. And one of those pieces was the booster uh, manufacturer called Morton Thiel, and the person who's responsible to say go or no go was this guy named Robert Lund, who's the vice president engineer at Morton Thiel. And you can see this real low res photo of him. You can barely see him. He's been scrubbed from the internet. As you could probably attest to why. So Morton Thiel was the manufacturer of the shuttle booster rockets. The boosters were built in Utah in these individual pieces, and then they were assembled in Florida. And when they were assembled, they were held together by these rubber O-rings, kind of like in the plumbing. When you take apart your faucet, you'll see these O-rings that prevent leaking. And then the O-rings kept all that liquid rocket fuel contained in the rockets. The contract was worth $150 million. And on the night of January 27th, Robert Lund was worried. The Space Center was counting down for the shuttle launch the next morning. Lund was a vice president for engineering at Morton Thiel and had earlier presided over a meeting of engineers of the booster rocket. They all unanimously recommended going against the launch. He had concurred, and he had informed his boss, his name is Gerald Mason, and then Mason informed the Space Center, saying that their engineering team has recommended now a no-go in the launch. Thus, Lund had expected the flight to be postponed. People respected the center safety record, and it was because it was good because the center would not allow a launch unless the technical people approved. So here is the booster rockets. So you can see the two booster rockets. They're attached to this huge gas tank, if you will, and these booster rockets would get ignited, and for the first couple of minutes of the launch, sending the shuttle into the upper atmosphere, and then the shuttle rockets would take over. So one of the things you've learned is from the Netflix that the fuel and the way these rockets were designed, with these solid rockets, is once they're ignited, you can't put them out. They have to extinguish themselves. So you can imagine that just the dangers in that. So these pieces of the boosters, like I said, they were built in one place and shipped in Florida. Then they were screwed together and held together with these O-rings. You can see that if these O-rings failed, there would be catastrophic effects. So they knew at the time there are some known factors. So at first, Lund had not approved. He had not approved because the temperature of the launch would be close to freezing at liftoff. The Space Center was worried about the ice already forming in place on the boosters, but Lund's worry was the O-rings sealing the booster segments. Data from previous flights indicated that O-rings tended to erode in flight, with the worst erosion occurring on the coldest preceding liftoff. The erosion seemed to increase as the rings lost their elasticity and resiliency decreased with temperature. At certain temperatures, the rings could lose so much resiliency that one could fail to seal properly, and if a ring failed in flight, the shuttle could explode. And as engineers, their job was to focus on people rather than on things. So just keep in mind that concept. Unknown factors, well, there was no testing below 40 degrees, and the data that was available was extrapolated from a few sources. We knew that there were unknown to other people at the time. For us watching the TV that NASA was having this incredible pressure to launch and to not scrub the mission, from Congress to taxpayers and hubris, like basically, you know, the arrogance of how sometimes we thought about ourselves at that time as, America's number one, we beat the Russians and all that. So Lund's decision still was a go or no go at this time, and he was on the fence. Now, what his boss approached him, um, he said something that made Lund think again. Mason asked him, his boss, to think like a manager than an engineer. So take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. So what his boss is telling him is like, stop thinking like an egghead. Stop thinking about risks. Think about what we can get from this and the management. So stop thinking about people. Stop thinking about safety. Think about what we can get and what we can lose on the management side. Face value, uh, amount of people watching the launch, Congress, funding, and all that. So, what do you think Mason meant by this? And what was he asking Len to do? So, what his boss was saying is think again, think about the ramifications, think about what's most important here. Literally, do not think about the people, do not think about what you know and the concerns you have and what your one job is do here is to protect people. And so Lund changed his mind. He was pressured. And if one of the things that we want to do here, look at this case study, is there going to be sometime in your life, someone's going to approach you and pressure you to change your decision when you know that is the wrong decision. And for us, we have to reach into ourselves and pull the courage to say, no, that's wrong. That might even cost you a job. That might cost you a relationship. That might cost you, hard things. But in the end, this is what resulted. So the next morning, the shuttle exploded during liftoff, killing all aboard. And as we know now, we'll learn from the next slide what the exact cause was. But you could see here, this was the main explosion, and then this was the booster rockets that were falling over to the side to side. And keep in mind, I was watching this live, and so I grew up watching, because we lived here by Vandenberg, where we see a launch. We used to see a launch every month. I knew exactly when a launch failed, and I knew exactly what this failed. And if you look on the YouTube time, you look at the YouTube of the faces of the people there, including the wives and the children and the parents of the astronauts, they didn't know. They didn't know what's going on. It took them minutes after the launch and seeing this unfurl to find out that there was a catastrophic failure. And what the horrible stories on this is that when they located the remains of the astronauts, they actually had the data from the suits. These people were alive. They didn't. This explosion didn't necessarily kill these people. What killed them was going into the earth at over 200 miles an hour and it's slamming into the ocean. And a horrible, just a way to die. And this was all has to do with that one decision to think like a manager rather than an engineer. So what we know, the shuttle launched and scheduled. It exploded after a little over a minute in the air, killing all 7 astronauts. They found out what the root cause was. It was the O-rings, and the O-rings failed. The seals leaked rocket fuel, and then the rocket fuel actually blew a hole into that huge tank and exploded. The vessel exploded. So what should Haviland done? He should have stuck to his game, his original original decision to not launch, to think more about the people rather than things. To think like a manager rather than engineer is to focus on people rather than things. Engineers are required to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, to issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, to act in professional matters for each employer or client as truthful agents and trustees, and to avoid all conflicts of interest. The code of ethics of an engineer is necessary in part because without it, the self interest of the individual engineers, or even their selfless devotion to their employer, can lead them to harm everyone overall. This was the shuttle was actually going to be launched in Vandenberg at the time. The one of the main aspects of the shuttle exploding was that it set the whole program like 3 or 4 years back, and it essentially wiped out the the launching of the shuttle on the West Coast. And if that launch had not happened and that explosion did not happen, we would have had an incredible technical boom here on the Central Coast. Cal Poly would have been the MIT of the West. This huge infrastructure they built, they were going to launch this year, was scrapped. And my brother and my dad both got laid off. So there was, it touched everybody in the community. It touched Cal Poly as well. So let's talk about what is a definition of an engineer. And again, we got to have to start thinking like an engineer in our design processes. So engineering is a broader set of ideals, simplicity, practicality, systematic thinking, and the idea that understanding a thing or process isn't assured until that thing can be built. And this came from Dmitry Tchaikovsky, who was a bioengineer. The creative application of scientific principles to design or develop structures, machines, apparatus, or manufacturing processes. And by that credo, engineering serves not only to expand the boundaries of knowledge, but rather as a link between existing scientific discovery and technological benefit. Why we should start thinking like an engineer is because a lot of the people we've learned, these quality gurus, they actually were engineers. And so in order for us to solve quality problems, we need to start thinking like engineers. And so how do they think? One of the things that we're going to use is the scientific method. So the scientific method is used to search for cause and effect relationships. The scientific method starts when you ask a question about something that you observe: how, what, when, who, which, why, or where, and then you construct a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess about how things work. If I do this, then this will happen. You test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. You conduct a fair test by making sure that you only change one factor at a time while keeping all the other conditions the same. You should also repeat your experiment several times to make sure that the first results are not just an accident. And in the world of engineering and in science, after you came up with a result that the hypothesis was true, then you would get it peer reviewed. So again, you see there's a problem, you construct a hypothesis. If I do this, I expect this to happen. You test it, and then you analyze results, and then you determine if the hypothesis is true, or if it's partially true, or if it's false. And then if it's false, you redo it again. In the scientific method, there are two things we want to be concerned or know about. First one is called scenario planning, which is the process of systematically constructing a series of hypothetical situations, then mentally simulating what you would do if they occurred. What would I do if X happened? The counterfactual simulation is figuring out what you would do if the hypothetical events in a scenario planning occurs. Well, I would do this. So there's two parts of that part of the scientific method. When you would do, this is what you would. What would I do? Well, I would do this: scenario planning and counterfactual simulation. And when we're thinking like an engineer, going back to that signal and the noise analogy, the signal here is truth, and the noise is everything else that distracts us from the truth. So by testing predictions by experiments, we try to separate the signal from the noise, from the truth from the non-truth. The truth breaks paradigms and biases that hold us captive in failing to solve problems or improve. So when we're trying to find the objective truths here, those objective truths, once they're found out, will allow us to change the way we think and to correct our thinking. And if once we do that, we are stepping over all the biases, all the heuristic and the cognitive biases that we all have. There's many scientific findings that are commonly accepted today, which would have been, dismissed as a hooey at one point. It's like my high school textbook looks completely different than your high school textbook because things get reproven. I mean, when I was a kid, Pluto was a planet. All right. So one of the main ways that when we're looking at this as far as problem solving as an engineer is we're looking at probability as a problem solver decision tool. So going back, probability, the study of events whose outcomes are random. Random happenings are those which individual outcomes we do not or cannot know in advance. The future. Probability is used in strategic decision making. Game theory is often the optimal strategy, is one that involves intentionality, including randomness. Business and sports strategies are often probabilistic in nature rather than deterministic. And remember, a deterministic says 100% will come from, effect will come from, or cause will come from this effect. Very few things in life are deterministic. An amazing accomplishment of probability is to put a meaningful numerical value on things we admit we do not know. So, say we flip a coin once, we have no idea how it will land. But we flip it many times in the aggregate, then we start seeing a pattern in a specific frequency. The random happenings will display regularity the more we do it. So we flip a coin 1 million times, we know by counting heads or tails that it will land heads up very close to 50% of the time. And you can repeat that experiment. So the law of large numbers is where we get clear order, which comes from random activities by examining the aggregate, the many. So random activities repeated many times. So say like if we're going to roll a die, so we have six possible numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The possibility of getting any number higher than 7, it's impossible, right? The possibility of rolling a 3, well, just one time, roll it just one time, but it's pretty low. So you get 1, 6. So the more times you roll the dice, the closer we come to the predicted probability of expected value of rolling the 3. So if we roll, just once, it's a really pretty low probability. But if we roll it a lot of times, we start seeing a pattern in the aggregate. And we can start saying, well, we have 1, 6, or 17% chance of rolling a 3. And then when we subtract 1 from the probability of not achieving the event, then we get the 1 minus the probability. That's where we get the probability of not achieving the event. So either 5, 6, or 83% of the time, we will not be rolling a 3. So that's how sometimes you'd see a lot of how the probability goes, probability of an event occurring or the probability of an event not occurring. And the amazing accomplishment is, again, putting the meaningful numerical value on things we omit, we do not know. So as a decision maker, there's a little graph right here, impossible, right? So that's like rolling a 7. But as we roll 1 and 6, it's unlikely. Remember, 17%, but it's still potential, it's still probable. And then an even chance, 50-50, is half. And then when we start going into 4 or 5 chance, pulling of a daisy wheel here, you get 1 out of 5, 4 and 5 chance of doing that, and then you have certainty of 100%, which is deterministic. So depending on whatever decision we were trying to, we can view probability as a sliding scale from 0, the event never happening, to various degrees of the event happening from low to high. And again, 1 meaning that the event will absolutely happen. So everything we do could potentially have a probability assigned to it. What's the probability of you losing your keys? Well, we could probably put a sign on. We could probably assign a numerical value on that. So there are 2 types of probability which we want to look at. With the frequentist, which is the frequency of which a repeated event occurs. It's applied to the outcomes of actual or hypothetical experiments that have that have an element of randomness. That is the law of large numbers applies to the frequentist type of probability. And then we have the Bayes theorem or the conditional, the probability of an event under the assumption of the existence of or happiness satisfaction of another event. So this is the principle, the result of experiments or more evidence is to update probability distributions indicating a change in belief. So we have a probability, something happens, and we apply that probability to the previous probability, and that comes up with a new probability. So augmented reality, machine learning, and most real-life applications of probability use conditional modeling. And this is where we start seeing, automated cars and AI. They all use the conditional model. This is like the machine is learning from experiences and is using it by probability. So what is an example? So say we have 52 cards in a deck. 12 are face cards, and 6 of the 12 face cards are red. What is the probability that you'll get a face card? Well, the probability of just getting a face card are 12 divided by 52, which is around 23%. So now you're saying, what is the probability to get a face card that is red? So we know that the face card is the 12, and then we know there's 6 red face cards. So we say 12 by 52 times 6 by 12 equals 23.23 times 0.50, which gives us a new number, which again reduces our probability of receiving that card because it's conditional, because not only are we looking for a face card, we're looking for a red face card. So you can see this would continue happening until we get to what we're actually looking for. And conditional probability, as I said, is used, our DNA is based on conditional probability. Augmented reality, all the algorithms and all the logistics that we see is all based on conditional probability. Even Jeopardy, when Watson, the computer, was competing against American, Ken and Brad, who were the 2 top players at the time, they use probability. So he would say, the computer would have potential answers, and then the highest probability would be the number that he would be the answer that he would apply. And of course, that was good enough to beat our world's greatest Jeopardy players. There's a shift in baseball. We're watching the World Series right now. You can see this how certain batters come up, they look at the probability of where they hit the ball, and they shift the players of the infield or the outfield. So you can see here, there's only a 6% chance that this batter is going to hit this to deep third base. So there's a 94% chance that the batter is going to get into an out. There is a 6% acceptable risk that the batter will not get out, will get a hit. So there's always an acceptable risk, and there's always the accepted confidence level, if you will, that I'm okay with a 94% probability of achieving it out. There's probability rebounds in basketball. There's probabilities in politics. 93% chance to win October 21st in 2016. 93%, and we all knew how that happened. So, probability has a sense that, we can be wrong in our assumptions, and also it means that we also can achieve something that's outside of what we actually predicted. I overheard this. A degree in engineering is the new liberal arts degree for the 21st century. And we all in GRC are going to get a liberal art degree. So, but your guys' language is got to be in engineering, specifically with the fields you're going to be going to. Highly technical, logistics, and a lot of knowledge on coding and a lot of knowledge on software and stuff. You will be engineering. In the liberal arts degree, how it used to prepare the student in life skills of reasoning, logic, knowledge, and appreciation in arts, history, and ethics. Engineering is the new liberal arts degree in that it gives us the basis for not only logistics and logic in in non-technical areas of our lives, but in the technical fields as well. So how do engineers think? Well, they focus on the long term. They're patient. They don't try to solve every problem. They minimize interruptions. They disregard information they do not need. They reduce a model to its essential components. And best test of understanding is to build it. So can you see this, how this can easily be translated into a branding program, a branding campaign? Everything here is applicable in doing that, or designing an app, or designing a website, or designing a poster. So engineers love to solve big problems, ones where it could take years to develop a full solution. You have to be patient when developing new technology. You got to be forgiving. You don't try to solve every problem. You must align client need with what is best for the product and business. In minimizing interruptions, it's important to have large blocks of quiet time when you can think clearly and work productively. Focusing on scale, once you get multiple requests for the same feature, then consider creating a solution. Have a plan. Engineering teams require a roadmap, a description of all the features that a product will eventually need to build a great product. A roadmap's timeline should not extend out at least 12 to 18 months and be updated regularly. Roadmap should be specific in the near term and broader the further out you go. And then stick to your vision. It's essential to stay focused and remind yourselves of the problem and what you were trying to solve in the first place. Does the new idea build off the original idea, or is it a tangent? What will happen if the business of 3 months are devoted to developing a feature that nobody ends up using? And on that note, what the engineers do is focus on the solve state. So we have a problem state, and then we have a solve state, and then we have this solution path. So this looks very similar to the A3 when we start looking at developing designing a plan. So we have the problem state, and we have the solve state. So we have the actual state, and we have the ideal state. So we pay at least as much attention to the solve state as to the problem state. Theoretically speaking, we're trying to move from the problem state to the solve state. We do so by traversing what is called the solution path. Unfortunately, the problem state typically attracts all our attention. But if we are not in an emergent situation, if we still have nothing more in mind than doing something to get rid of ourselves of the problem state, we can create situations where the solution to one problem creates one or more new problems. So you ask yourself questions like, how will I know that the problem has been solved? What will accept as evidence? What does the solved state look like? And the third way is to be clear about all the goals and objectives of the problem solving effort. So again, we're stuck in a problem state. We do not want to be focused on the problem state. We want to be focused on where we're going, which is the solve state, the problem state to the solve state. And the path to get there is the solution path. This is the kind of a modification of the priority matrix. But we were saying, do we want it? Do we have it? This helps us develop, be clear about all our goals and objectives. If we do not have it and we want it, we want to achieve it. If do we have it? Yes. Do we want it? We want to preserve it. If we do not have it and we do we want it? No. And no. Then we want to avoid it. And then do we have it? Do we want to get rid of it? Do we want it? And we say no. Then we want to eliminate. So these four areas would be areas that we can use to define our goals and objectives. So, in expanding our definition of the problem, rarely are definitions of the problem stated or the solved state crystal clear. Clarity typically develops over time. In many cases, the definition of a problem may be considered complete only after the problem has been solved. To define means to establish boundaries, to encompass, to include, to locate, to isolate, to distinguish. To differentiate, to set apart, to define the problem or the solve state means at the very least to do the following. First is to establish boundaries, that is the locate. To give distinguishing characteristics, which is to differentiate or isolate. To state the nature of and describe precisely, articulate, and to state the meaning of and to provide a definition, which is explicate. Where this comes into our thinking as designers is we're all going to be designing these processes. So there's a couple of things that I want us to understand in system engineering, that ways that we can affect the process. So cessation, improving the process by not doing much. So you're actually improving by not messing with the process. Remember the observer effect, or you're actually affecting the process by measuring it. Here, you're letting the process stabilize or go its course, and if you actually started to improve in it, you would actually create more damage. Resilience, flexibility of a system to handle anything thrown at it without failing. Fail-safe, get into backup system. Redundancy, designed to prevent or allow recovery from a primary system failure. So these are all the things that we want to consider in our processes. Stress testing, identifying the boundaries of a system by simulating specific environmental conditions. Engineering, what would it take to break the system? So we got resilience, fail-safe, stress testing. Those are all areas that we could do as using engineering principles in our design processes, or not doing anything. Here's a law that is going to haunt us probably for the rest of our lives. It says, a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked, a simple system that worked. The inverse proposition also appears to be true. A complex system designed from scratch never works. It cannot be made to work. You have to start over, beginning with a simple system. That's John Gall. That's not That's not the Atlas Shrugged John Gall, but that's John Gall, who was a system theorist. So the Gall's law explains why it's hard to design complex systems. Systems only work over time with many edits and many fixes, and it has to start from a simple system. For those of us who are web designers using this UX UI, this is going to haunt you. So we have to start from a system that works at the very embryonic level before we start adding more complex things to it. This is a case study on what that means and how that Gall's law is applied. So this is the Obamacare website, which was a great idea to enroll 20 million people into healthcare who didn't previously have healthcare, and the agency that was required to do this, that was tasked to do this, was the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, otherwise known as CMS. They oversaw the new programs under the new healthcare reforms and had almost 700,000 applications have been submitted online on either the federal or the state websites. So this was how people would enroll into this healthcare. There was complaints about logging in, lengthy delays, incomplete information related to insurance companies, and other problems. This all fueled the political attacks on the 2010 Affordable Care Act. It did not help that whole process to be popular, and it was only because of the Supreme Court allowing keeping that program alive that it remained. Some of the criticism was by contractors at the hearing, saying that due to a compressed time frame, the system just wasn't tested enough, especially for high volume. So it wasn't tested to scale. In the first detailed account of what happened, of why this website crashed and was a failure, officials of the 4 contractors involved in the website creation described a convoluted system of multiple companies operating separately under the oversight of the CMS. Each said their individual components generally performed as planned after internal testing, but all conceded that CMS failed to conduct sufficient end-to-end testing of the entire system before the launch. Again, Gall's law. They blamed a decision by CMS that within 2 weeks of the launch, it changed the architecture of the website to require users to fully register in order to browse for health insurance products instead of just being able to get information anonymously as originally planned. So within 2 weeks of the launch of the website, they changed the architecture of the website. And while the technical change to require registration was easy, the result was a much greater burden on the system that it failed to handle. Again, it wasn't tested. However, was warned that the system's problems ahead of the launch, so people warned of the system's problems, but that was not enough. That was not enough for the political pundits to say that this was an entire failure. So even though that the process itself, getting the people to be enrolled was not necessarily the problem, it was the actual website. So as designers of web and UX UI, good case study as far as stress testing, resiliency, all the things that they should have done. And this is a government agency. This was a website that was in the billions of dollars in order to make. So it was a colossal failure. This should look familiar. This looks a lot like the A3. So in the solution engineering, they think of the problem solving as covering all the bases. So solving a problem in a complex organization has much in common with detective work. We are forced to follow leads and unearth clues. The task of problem solving is very much a type of intelligence work, a matter of piercing things together. So we have from define the problem all the way to troubleshoot. So this for the solve state. So you can see all the solution engineering is the kernels, if you will, to the A3. We're using the solution engineering in our A3 in solving problems. This is one that kind of blows my brain, is to take the concept of cause with a grain of salt. Not all problems can be said to be caused, and not all causes can be corrected. Fundamental change in paradigm thinking as far as how we view things in the real world. The concept of cause is relevant in some cases, but not in others. Take the time early in your problem solving efforts to decide if the concept of cause is or isn't relevant before you spend time and energy looking for something that does not exist or cannot be corrected. Beware of our own blinders. We're all aware a custom tailored set of blinders or biases that are perceptual and value based filters that lead us to see or not see certain things or to interpret them in certain ways. These blinders are sometimes useful, sometimes, but in all cases, it pays to know what they are. Knowing what we wish to achieve, preserve, avoid, and eliminate, and why can help us sort out how much of the analytical acts we're grinding in personal things and how much of it's rational problem solving. So we need to know what they are. We need to know what are we subject to as far as our biases and our blinders. Some of the major biases we talked about were the class. That's actually in the book. Is incentive cause biases. Incentives are automatically influence the way people act based on how they're awarded. Changing the incentives likely changes behavior. HIPPO is a form of model bias, automatic assumption that our idea approaches best, is the highest paid person's opinion, HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion, most often is the model bias. So when someone comes in who's the big cheese, we assume that those people they know what's going on. And the confirmation bias is the tendency to look for and see only evidence that confirms what we already believe. Three major biases that we can and blinders that we can enlist if we do not know what they are. And then one of the things I like to just drive to this course, if you're listening to this, is we've given you a lot of things, from Lorraine to Ken to Xiaoying, a lot of information as far as for you to go into the industry. But it's your job to develop your own system of solving problems, and also just of how you're going to be a person, how you're going to be that graphic designer or that website or UX UI designer. You cannot simply use someone else's tools or conceptual tools. You have to have a certain amount of adaptation. The point is that you simply cannot pick up someone else's tools and make immediate use of them. You have to be able to adapt, claim ownership, if you will, on certain things that ring true to you and things that reflect more of your values in creating a whole new system, if you will, for solving problems. And then here are things I just want to close on to the general views of what we do in solution engineering. Well, for one thing, if there is a problem, you have to take action. You have to do something. A problem is a situation that requires action. If something does not require action, then it's not a problem. A solution is a course of action that changes the problem situation. So it's a solution, you do something, and that changes the problem situation. We do often more than just try to solve the problem state, right? We do more than often try to solve the problem state. We tend to sometimes go overboard and actually make something worse. Often than not, we seek other states of affairs in place of the problem state. We want to make sure we keep our eyes cleared and focused on the solve state. The causes of the problem state are not always correctable. That's a key point. Keep the solve state firmly fixed in mind. Drive that home. Sometimes we know immediately what to do, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we need to investigate before intervention, sometimes we don't. Successful investigation is knowing what you're looking for and where to look for it. An investigation is guided by a frame of reference of the problem solver, and the frame of reference labels a problem. And then if we have the wrong label, then we have the wrong frame of reference. So, what are the types of problems we have in the real world? Well, we have man problems, attitude problems, we have performance problems in man, also in machine, management, measurement, systems, staffing, training, productivity, personal, morale, legal, feedback, communication, political, organizational, capacity, control, motivation, health, financial, and resource. One thing I can guarantee you is that you're not going to be short of problems in the real world, or even in your life now, as we have seen with COVID. There's no shortage of problems.